All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. Today, I'm talking about Mars in Virgo conjunct the South Node in a square to Venus in Gemini. Now, I have to admit, I have been this, I guess, just based on my chart and the fact that I have a lot of not Gemini, a lot of mutable placements that I have been feeling uneasy about this Mars in Virgo transit. But the fact that it's now at least past the South Node and in around August the 8th, it'll be ingressing into Libra, which will be per, this is perhaps one to watch for. Is that we've got basically Mars doing the third decan of Virgo, and then by the time it completes that, it will be in an opposition to Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And so I was thinking, as a what this whole dynamic feels to me, perhaps keeping in mind the fact that there is something that I feel some a degree of uneasiness about the Mars South Node Virgo thing. To me, what the resonant tarot card image for this one is none other than the Tower, in the sense that if you consider the fact that the North Node and the South Node, these are the nodes of the moon. The idea here is that when the full moon and the new moon happen in alignment with the nodes, that's when we get the eclipses. And basically, there's this whole kind of elaborate mythology about the head and the tail of the dragon. There's something to me about the North Node and the South Node and Mars being kind of like this, being kind of elevated or inflated or fallen and deflated. And there's this kind of thing about like the high and the low and that kind of thing. And then I'm also kind of thinking, in the midst of this, the fact that Mars is ruling the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries feels kind of like the hanged man in a way to me, right? Because it's like Saturn, the restriction of this guy being bound, he's not going anywhere, and he's kind of immobilized, but he's a lot more peaceful than the guys in the Tower card are like trying to get up to the top, reach the heights, and they're getting blasted down and falling. Whereas this guy is the reverse dynamic, right? Like, instead of rising up to the top and then getting blasted down, this guy is hanging upside down in a kind of submissive position. There's this kind of a yin and yang dynamic to this going on, right? And so there's this kind of alternating pressures, I find. And there's something about I've started doing these videos in this other area where I have my modular synthesizer set up, which I'm not using for these videos. It just happens to be, well, it's convenient for me because it's convenient for me to use my computer I use for recording to also just record videos on. Basically, this is basically out of pure laziness I could get like a backdrop and have outer space behind me, or like a green screen, or put up an astrology circle or something in the background or whatever. But right now, I'm just going with this. And one of the things about this is that I have to admit that why not apply things like astrology or the archetypes to something like these kinds of hobbies that I have, right? One of the things about this is that I have to admit there's some kind of why I enjoy things like this is I don't consider myself to be autistic, but there is this thing associated with autism called hyperfocusing. And I think to some degree, maybe we're all becoming autistic. But I find that when it comes to niche hobbies, like, one of the things that I love about electronic music is that despite what's going on in the world, despite what's going on in my life, I can just like absorb myself in this for a period of time. And the feeling of being absorbed is like a feeling of being highly concentrated. And there's something about that which, regardless of whether or not, well, I mean, the thing, if you're not happy with what you're making, it could be frustrating, right? But if you can at least be at least happy enough with what it is that you're doing in your highly focused state. There's something about this where it's like it gives you the pleasure of doing something that you enjoy, and then it also has this effect of blotting out all this other stuff that you don't like, right? And then the problem is that what I find is that there's a lot of creative people may get into this habit, I think, about being very like insulated of like they're making their stuff in a very like closed off like safe cocoon bubble, and there's this sort of anxiety about like putting things out to the world or whatever. And I feel like that kind of creative anxiety is kind of like a tower card thing, right? Because there's this kind of thing of like, if you're an artist and I'm gonna spend all this time, a whole bunch of time creating work that I will eventually like, you know what I'm trying to think of? Like, it's like, you know how they use this expression to like drop an album or to like drop a mixtape, or to like, there's some kind of like or like to drop the bass even. There's something about the tower where it's like, or like, it's also kind of like, yeah, you go with this EDM joke direction where they have risers and they have drops. And or I don't tend to like, even though I like electronic music, sometimes when I show it to people, they're like, where's the drop? Where's the riser? I get into more like just formulaic EDM trance music or something, right? But there's this kind of like, this kind of thing about like the drop, which is like, there's something where you're like, there's the anxiety is like, if you're creating something and if you drop it, if your drop is going to be a flop, if you're going to like drop the splash of the turd in the toilet bowl or something, right? Or like, this is the verticality of the high and the low, right? Where like in your own, like, and this is one thing that I have to admit, it could be part of my early childhood conditioning, but part of the reason why I have, for example, a piano behind me and I have a poster of you, it says Ella Fitzgerald and Tommy Flanagan and Joe Pass on it. My dad was a jazz musician, right? And there was, I probably mentioned this before or whatever, but like I have all this stuff. Grew up in a highly musical environment, exposed to lots of jazz and lots of music and stuff like that. And whether there's something about, sometimes jazz gets a bad reputation, that the jazz musician is much more interested in what he is doing than anybody else is. And there's also just as the phenomenon of the attention economy, right? Of like, but prior to the days of the internet where everybody's competing for attention online, if you as a small child are trying to compete for attention from your parent, then your parent is consumed in this hyper-focused state of blotting out all the other problems of his life and just focusing on his instrument. There's something about that which is like, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. It may just be neutral, right? It's just something that you do. It's something that, you know, we all at sometimes are in our own individualized, closed off, narrow space where we just want to hyper focus on this one thing that gives us joy, to the extent where we are neglecting our children, our loved ones, our friends, our families, our communities, and we're like, whatever, man, this is my transcendence. This is what gives me escape from all the problems in the world, to just hyper focus on this one thing I enjoy doing, even if, you know, you may think I'm a pretentious, self-inflated asshole. You know, there's a certain kind of, this is the inflation, right? There's the idea that you are up your own shit and you're inflated and you know, this is it's not just music. It could also be with like reading books, right? You could be like, I'm gonna read some heady stuff, man. I'm gonna get some big ideas, some lofty stuff, and then there's this sort of anxiety about like, wait a minute. So then what happens if you know, to me this is really interesting, but what happens if you try to make conversation with somebody and you just come off as a pretentious asshole, or you think you're smart but then the other person actually knows more about it, and then you're maybe a mansplainer now. So you think you're an expert because you read something, and now you're like, oh no, it can't. You're like, oh shit, I tried to talk about something I was passionate about, and now I'm criticized as an arrogant mansplainer who's self-inflated and full of his own bullshit. You know, like, is this kind of, there's this sort of anxiety about like, or like anything. You're in you build up your own tower of like, you know, I've got all this cool shit that I'm into, and now I want to somehow, you know, there's actually a world of other people. I think the music is a good example of this, because there's something about like, in my own little, if I just retreat into my own little world, of the things that I get excited about. For some reason, it's like I can have I don't know why, but with things like delay and reverb effects and loops and like I don't know, weird like special effects and things like that. To some extent, there could be like I can cultivate a certain attitude where there's a certain juice that there's a certain kind of excitement around these things, which to others people may have developed a cynical attitude in that you, you know what I mean? Like people are like, what's like, why get so excited about, but it could be anything. Why get excited about delay effects? Why get excited about reverb? Why get excited about like comic book superheroes? Why get excited about, you name it, knitting sweaters. Hold on. What I was trying to talk about is that I think, in the sense that there's, I think that the Tower card, the hyper focusing of the Tower card, and the eventual, or like, even if there's something about also maybe like partying and getting a hangover or something like that, where you like try to revel and have a good time and party, but then eventually things turn sour, or people get into a fight or something like that, or you just wake up the next day and you're like, what was that all about? What happened, right? And now you feel like you've fallen off of the whatever cloud nine your temporary moment bubble of ecstasy has burst, and now you've fallen to some disreputable place. Or else there's this kind of thing about like it could be the idea that you have a bad habit, and now you feel the inclination to drop your bad habit, or that because you've been dropped, you yourself have been cast out or something. Another thing about this, in current events, I recently saw in the news there was some embarrassing incident at a Coldplay concert. As if getting caught at a Coldplay concert wasn't embarrassing enough. Sorry, I'm not the kind of person who likes Coldplay. There's this thing that happened where like a couple was on the Jumbotron and they're like trying to be like, look at this cute couple, isn't it romantic? But the moment they were on, they were like shocked and they ran away or whatever, or because there was the sort of a conflict of interest with a guy who was in a this is kind of funny because as if there's this whole other conversation there about like, are we so naive in our society that we expect that relationships are going to be free of power dynamics, or that, especially, but there's a standard anyways around workplace relationships that can be seen as a compromise of ethics and integrity if there's a power dynamic in terms of a superior person and there being some sort of like coercing people who are in positions beneath you into a relationship dynamic because you're their superior and stuff. And that there's something about it where maybe there is, to some extent, there's ups and downs, or like pros and cons, or like the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. And maybe at some point in time, you might be feeling high on life. You might be like riding the honeymoon high of your power imbalance relationship, but then you have this moment where you're on the jumbo screen at the Coldplay concert and you're like, oh my god, and that moment is like a shock. It's like a disruption, and you are like that. Those people, when they saw themselves on the jumbo screen and they immediately flung out of each other's arms, that was like a tower moment, right? And I think that was a perfect Mars Virgo on the South Node in the square to Venus moment, right? Which I'm trying to like. Basically, this is my theme for the video: is Mars and Virgo on the South Node and the square to Venus, and this being kind of like the dropping moment of like, and it could be you're afraid to drop the album because the album is not very good, or that you in your own self-inflated jazz trance, you're obsessed, you're just in your weird like shredding on a flute solo or something like this, and you think you're hot shit, and then when you in that perspective of how your work is judged by others or perceived by others, there's a fall where you are cast out of your rock star ego is shattered, or your delusion of your romantic ideal is now the reality kicks in, kind of thing, right? And then similarly, there's the other character, the Hanged Man, which is in a submissive position, which could be, with Saturn and Neptune, it could feel oppressive or constraining even. But this, if you have a relaxed attitude and you surrender to it, then perhaps you are, perhaps you're going with the flow, right? But it's a different. What I thought was interesting about this is there's a kind of like there's still this vertical dynamic to both of them, and there's this kind of like force of gravity at work in both of these cards, right? There's like trying to get to the top and trying to chase this high, and then the highs and the lows, and then feeling like you're at a low. You're feeling like you've fallen off your pedestal, versus this sort of like the surrender of the Hanged Man, who's trying to do the opposite thing, right? Rather than try to get to the top, trying to let the force of gravity kind of work in the other direction, where he's not trying to work against it, but is rather working with it, and then kind of submitting to that gravitational force. Although if you're these people, if you're tower personality, you're more likely to be chasing the high, and the Hanged Man is more likely to submit to the low, right? And what's interesting though is that once Mars is approaches this opposition though to Saturn and Neptune, there will be a perhaps even more of this. There's also Mars is heading into a sign where it's in poor dignity, in Libra, right? Which is supposedly more inclined to peaceful negotiations rather than the Mars warrior stuff. So we have that to look forward to. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. This is what's on my mind right now. Thanks for watching.